love that we're both rocking the curls.
We are rocking the curls, and I love that the
Natural curl
recording.
club.
Yeah, and I love that the recording started right then. Because as I was just explaining to Mikaila, my lovely guest today, the idea, and you guys will have picked up on this already, the idea behind this podcast isn't to be, super polished with perfect editing and like fancy music coming in. It's really about getting access to those behind the scene conversations and the brilliant brains like Mikaila's and the expertise and the ideas that they have, without it being like a formal structured learning, but really just like Mikaila and I are having a cup of tea or a glass of wine together and you're listening into our discussion. So hi, Mikaila, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Hi. Why don't you start by giving our listeners a little bit of an introduction to you, aside from the curly hair, which I'm obviously a fan of.
Yes, so my name's Mikaila Read. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently the director of people and culture for a company called MUI. We are a distributed, fully remote team building a React component library. Well, it's more of an ecosystem really than it is a singular library, but for the tech listeners among us, they will know what I'm talking about. For the rest of us, we are helping designers and web developers and application developers create really incredible user interfaces that are also accessible. So
Yeah.
been with the team now for just over a year and a half, loving it and just loving the wild journey that is working in people operations.
I mean, that's what we're here to talk about.
Mhm.
So for us, just so everyone knows, our conversation that we had ahead of time really centered around the intersection of policy and culture. And particularly, a lot of things came up for us around time off. So that's what we're going to dive into today. And
Mhm.
just to get the ball rolling, why don't you share some of your thoughts about the intersection of policy and culture?
Yeah, definitely. So I think right off the bat, people hear these two terms, right, and immediately think there's this tension between them. And typically, policies is seen in the negative light, isn't it? It's like the constraint to culture, when in reality, I think that policies are more of a tool for actually shaping and reinforcing that culture, assuming that they start from a place informed by the company's values and desired culture to begin with, right? You can think about it this way. If a company has a strong culture, then policies are going to feel less like rules in that space and more like just statements about how the culture is enacted. It's going to sound more like, this is how we do things here. These are the boundary lines. This is what happens when someone steps outside of that. So yeah, I think they needn't be held in such a negative tension. They really do exist to support one another.
Yes. I mean, you spoke then about what happens when you have a solid culture. What
Mhm.
happens when you don't have a solid culture?
Oh gosh, great question. I mean, I think in summary, one word is like toxic, right? If you don't have a strong culture or you have a culture where your policies are competing with it, there's a mismatch there. There's lack of clarity. There's lack of consistency about how things are being implemented or applied. It's just a recipe for disaster. You're probably going to see lots of employee relations issues in a space like that, lots of productivity issues, lots of signs of struggle all over the board. Because without that strong culture, we know companies are not as successful in a variety of ways.
Mm. And what do you think about, I know we spoke about this a little bit, like like the reliance that we place on policy when there isn't a strong culture?
Yeah, this is a great one also. It can be really tempting, right, to quickly drop a policy to address something or to try and initiate a desired change within a space, but that usually is not very successful. And talking about over-reliance, I think it can look like a lot of different things. Over-reliance can look like you have just too many policies. There's too many rules for someone to practically remember. It can look like what I was referencing earlier. There's not a clear connection between the policies as they're written and the desired org climate. So you can end up with a lot of heavy, hard to read things that if they're hard to read, if they're a lot to read, they're not going to be adhered to probably. And I think like they really miss an opportunity also to drive culture in how they are written. Like I was thinking about earlier before we got on this call, how one of my favorite indicators for a company's culture is to go look at their bereavement leave policy and
Mm,
just read and compare it to others that exist in the company handbook. So many of them have this really similar speech pattern adopted still. It's very stiff, it's legalese, and there's definitions about different types of relationships that count or not under the policy, right? Um, Whereas when I was designing our bereavement leave policy at MUI, I intentionally wanted it to read as a letter to a friend who just experienced a loss.
mm,
And so it starts with just an opening line that, hey, if we love, we grieve. And so if you're reading this because you've lost or you're anticipating losing someone you care about, we are deeply sorry. And here's how we're going to support you. You see the difference in this like lost opportunity or grasped opportunity to demo your culture in how a policy is written, not just what is contained within there.
I mean, yeah, I literally had tingles, and I think that's very powerful for anyone listening to even take that as an action item to be like, let me review our bereavement policy. Have I even given thought to our bereavement policy? Have I given thought to exactly as you said, Mikaila, to how our policies are communicated and how
Mm.
that's an opportunity to communicate our culture versus checking a box?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wish people would get more excited about this because I know policies get a bad rap and people aren't excited about them, but I am telling you what, I see them as such a huge opportunity, not just to convey and reinforce positive culture, right? But I actually like to think of them as a justice mechanism, and we'll talk more about that later, but this is how I think about policy and culture and the intersection there and why I get excited thinking about policy.
Yeah. So speaking about policy, there's a famous policy that we spoke about that I think a lot of people listening have had conversations around because I also think it was hit quite a lot in the media. And that I'm talking about is unlimited paid time off. So,
Mhm.
and in particular in the media, there was a lot of reporting around the failures of it and companies not seeing the results that they wanted from this policy that was supposedly sounded amazing. So why do you think companies didn't see the results that they wanted from this policy?
Of course. And just to be completely clear up front, I am sitting well in the camp of still in defense of unlimited leave, to just make that abundantly clear. And I think I would connect this back to our earlier discussion on what is culture and policies and how they coexist together. And I would just say that your company policy is going to tell people if they can take leave or not in any given circumstances. But your company culture is going to tell them if they should.
Mm,
And spicy take, but for a lot of those companies that are pointing to unlimited leave failing, what I see happening is them pointing to poorly executed programs as proof that they don't work, which is just as lazy from a research standpoint or an implementation standpoint as designing the program poorly in the first place.
right. Right, like we're going to try this thing. It's kind of what you said, even in the earlier question. It makes me think about that with the bereavement policy too. It's not just doing the thing, it's how you do the thing. And when you
Absolutely.
and the intention behind it. That's
Yeah, and I hear that a lot when we have these discussions or they're visible out in the media or LinkedIn feed, wherever you're stumbling upon this, right? And there's always this oversimplified implementation that becomes very apparent, I feel. It's people saying, "We tried it, it didn't work." And the it that they tried turns out to be just lifting the cap and calling it a day,
mm,
which is obviously hardly strategic and it's unsurprisingly not going to be very effective. Like, what other programs do you approach with as little strategy upfront to support its success? And so I see oversimplification as one explanation potentially for why these haven't worked at some places. And another we talked about together was like the intent behind it. Who is this change actually being introduced to benefit, and how are we going about that?
mm, yes. It's a big thing. Even as you were speaking, I was thinking about like, are you committed to solving the problem? Are you committed to the outcome, or like, or not? Right? Because it's like you can keep iterating, keep learning, or you can just like sweep the rug under and be like, never mind, we tried it.
And to that point of, are you correcting the root problem? I think a great starting point to offer solutions and not just bash what frustrates me about this conversation.
Mm.
I think a great starting point for any business looking to trial or pilot unlimited leave, or maybe take a second shot at it if they tried it and it didn't work, would be to first start answering some of these questions, like, how viable is it for people to take leave here against their current job demands and resources? Like, what does that balance look like? Another question would be, what signals are my managers or leaders sending here around taking leave? Because that could point to a culture issue. Should also look at like what metrics are even available for tracking and sharing trends around time off. Can talk more about people looking for and seeking something to anchor their own lived experience in that isn't necessarily an upper limit, but they just want to understand their relation to the bigger whole at a business, right? And finally, what does your performance management or reward model say about taking leave? Is it incentivized or not? I saw a great example from a company just to really clarify and illustrate that last point. I saw a great example from a company that was offering cash bonuses or perks, like an entry to an experience or a paid holiday, for people that had met their target leave requirements for the year. So they had unlimited leave plus minimum desired target for every person to reach per year. Plus, if you meet that, we will reward you for doing so. Very clear and different picture to, you may now take as many days as you want, go forth and book leave.
Wow, such a different picture. I love the idea of, just for anyone listening, firstly, I hope you go back and take note of all those brilliant questions that Mikaila asked. But I love the idea of reminding everyone that you get to create reward policies and structures around anything that you want to prioritize, and that signals your culture and values as well. Because I do think, or I do wonder where we're not even seeing the opportunity to reward it. So I love that you gave a specific example there that people can, if you want to. I'm all for, being lazy, and by lazy I mean doing what already works. I'm all for saying like, oh, if this is what someone's trying and we value this, then let's just try what Mikaila shared as a starting point at least. So I love that you shared that. So what would you say is the role of managers? We've just spoken about the performance target. Is there anything else that managers need to be considering to ensure the success of policies?
Oh yeah. And gosh, I mean, I feel for managers out there, right? Like, let's just first acknowledge what a ridiculously huge responsibility it is to be a manager and how many things you have to look after as a manager. And so I think like we really have a responsibility, people like myself, any company leader, any business owner has a responsibility to helping ensure that their managers have what they need to support their people and to make sure that everyone has clarity of the expectations and things are being handled equitably. I think the role of management in ensuring success of these types of policies comes down to probably two main things. It's like generating buy-in to the talk and also walking the walk. So when we talked about earlier, company policies needing to very clearly connect to the desired culture and this like shared objective, this outcome, managers play a role in that, in communicating that outward and making sure people are a part of that conversation. And then, of course, like do as I do, not just as I say. Managers absolutely make the difference between it feeling safe and viable to take leave or not based on what they are doing and based on what they're doing themselves. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. What was it? Walk the walk and what the talk?
Yeah, like generate buy-in. I don't know what I was saying.
Yeah.
Generate buy-in to the talk,
Yes. Yeah, I
whatever
like
that
it.
means. Basically, just make sure people understand the intent, make sure there's clarity on that, make sure everyone understands how it benefits us all to
Yeah.
be participating in these policies and adhering to them.
Yes. And you spoke about the challenges that managers face. And I do think also managers can be under-resourced, as you've spoken about. So what can we do better to resource managers to oversee the success of policies?
Yeah, I can look back to another brilliant example out there, and a quick Google search or LinkedIn search will probably get you to find a person called Noah Warder. Shout out Noah, former head of people at Gusto in Canada. And I loved an example he shared about this when they implemented unlimited leave, and it consisted of ensuring managers had quarterly breakdowns of the time off that their teams were taking. So it's visible, it's accessible, it's arriving at the time they need. They don't have to go look for it. They don't have to compare or crunch the data to assess, like, is this person near burnout risk or not? How is this person comparing to the company average in terms of their time off taken, and so on. It's just a nudge to encourage people to take leave where they needed to, or maybe open an absence review conversation if needed. And I implemented the exact same thing actually from his model, from that example, where at MUI, I have an automated leave report that gets sent to every manager, summarizing the leave that their team has taken, making actionable suggestions to help them investigate and encourage people to take more leave, to look after wellness. And again, it's using that opportunity to reinforce the desired culture that we have, which is one of flexibility and autonomy and trust, by just saying in the end there, like, encourage the leave because it's actually a duty to your team to be well, right? It's actually beneficial to everyone to make sure that you're getting the time off that you require to be at your best. And you as a manager counts for you too. You need to make sure you're looking after yourself and showing up as the best leader you can for your team, which means taking some time off.
Absolutely. And I think we're in this interesting stage in society right now where we're starting to unlearn this idea that time off is bad and we're supposed to be productive all the time, and being productive means sitting at the desk or sitting at the bench.
Mm.
And I think that it's also an interesting time because we're seeing like there's a lots of different opinions right now. It was quite clear cut one way, and now we're in the unlearning process, which requires you actually, Mikaila, and anyone listening who manages a team or is head of the people function, to hold these different views. And I think that's kind of what we're speaking about here, of the importance of and the use, and why we shouldn't be hating on policies and culture, because really this is how we create that change faster and more effectively.
Absolutely. It makes me think of whenever I discuss policy with anyone, you usually get this question, don't you? Why can't we just let adults be adults? Right? Like, this is such a common thing to arise in conversations about leave or policy in general. And my response to that is usually like, I hear, why can't I just bake this cake without a recipe? And the truth is you can, sure, go for it, but something is probably going to go wrong. Not just something may, something is likely to go wrong there, because baking a cake and managing people are both a science. So just give the credit where it's due, and trust that these things were not designed to make your life difficult. They actually are designed and brought in to make things easier for us all.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things we spoke about previously, just to share with the listeners, is like, you have to remember that every adult in your organization, every adult in your team comes from cultural influences, societal influences, familial influences that like you don't know, you don't understand. And if you want to create that intentional culture, for example, you spoke about flexibility, like if you want to create that, you can't make assumptions that everyone just wants it. You have to, I always say
Absolutely.
this, like, I actually have a post coming out on LinkedIn about this week. Like, you have to be willing to sell to your people.
Mhm.
And we had someone actually speak about this, building out the business case on something else in a previous episode. But I think it's that you have to be willing to take, you know, the leadership decisions and responsibility for the implementation and responsibility for intentionally creating what you want to create, which is not what everyone wants to create initially, because not everyone has had the exposure or has the expertise that you have. That's why you're hired, right?
100%. And like, I think there's some interesting side conversations here around things like autonomy and differences in terms of capability or like diversity, right? This is what you're picking up on is we can't go play the game without the rules fairly defined and understood by all because we might be working with different rules, and that is just a recipe for disaster. And it's not saying one rule is better than the other or closer to right with a capital R. It's simply that these are the rules to define how we engage together in this space. And like culture, right, it is a social construct. So it doesn't exist outside of relationships. Or rather, I should say, relationships are like a foundational feature of culture. It's a social group phenomena. So it's important to bring everyone that's a part of that culture into a conversation on it. Everyone a part of that group needs to have the conversation and contribute to it.
Yes, so powerful. Thank you. Let's go backwards a little bit to discuss the idea of fairness. How do we see things as fair? Let's go back to even this like unlimited paid time off example. How do we see it as fair when one person is taking like 45 days off a year and another person is taking 15 or
I love this question. I think it connects back to another thing you were talking about earlier, which was a separate episode talking about productivity, business productivity and metrics, right? Because I think that question relies on a quite simplistic view of what fairness even is, to be honest with you. It's not something reducible to numbers. One person taking 45 days off and one people taking 30 days, that is not inherently unfair, right? And I love this image. I'm sure if anyone Googles it, the image we've seen from the Interaction Institute for Social Change, the artist's name is Angus McGuire, and I'll just describe it for anyone listening if they haven't seen it. On the left-hand side, you have 3 people standing on the exact same size box to peer over a fence. And each of these people are different heights. They're standing on the same support, but some of them can see over the fence because of their height, and some of them still can't see over the fence because of their natural height. And then on the right side, you have those same people having different supports. They are standing on different size boxes, or maybe not standing on a box at all, but now they are all able to see and peer over the fence equally. And I love that illustration as an illustration for this exact conversation we're having about fairness within policy.
yes.
I think there's also to talk about the productivity piece. Productivity is not simply tasks being worked on or not, right? Like that is a very simplistic view of what productivity means. And I would say when we think about having deviations in how people are accessing policies or resources or getting support, taking different amounts of leave, like it boils down to the fact that maximizing productivity can mean accommodating diverse work styles and needs. And that actually acts to enhance employee satisfaction, org effectiveness, the bottom line, you name it. Like it gets better when you give people the tailored support they need to be at their best.
I love thinking here of the elevator example, right? Like the elevator wasn't created for everyone in mind, but everyone benefits.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's such a even better than than the illustration I'm referring to, and so much easier to grasp while listening.
Yeah, it's a good one. And just to share, when Mikaila and I were speaking out, a lot of the work that I do outside of this does support neurodiversity, just in its nature. And I was sharing how, I think it was with you anyway, but either way, you'll hear it now. One of the feedback we got from a client was one of their employees was working really long hours for a few days and then out for a few weeks, and working really long hours, really intensely for a few days, and then out for 1 to 2 weeks. And actually, when they measured productivity, they were one of the most productive people on the teams. But when you look at it in this way, in this like, how many days are you in, how many days are you out, you lose the ability to build a culture that is actually more productive and that is more sustainable and that does meet the individual, team, and organizational goals, because we're so busy. I think we've created this really unrealistic, oversimplified, as you said, way of viewing time, where it's like 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 2 and 1 plus 1 equals 2. And it's like, it's not about the time. Exactly.
It's not, especially for knowledge workers, like productivity is not reducible to task is being completed or task is not. I am working on task or I am not working on task at the time. In fact, some of the best organizational psychologists out there, like Adam Grant, who, of course, I'm chief of the fan club for Adam Grant, talks about the need for brilliant ideas, solutions, to have an incubation period. And that incubation is actually rest. It's literally not actively thinking about the problem. Your brain is doing that in the background for you, and you're going to arrive somewhere incredible if you allow it to do so. But if you sit at your desk and think to yourself, well, it's not 5 p.m. yet, and I must work on task, must think on task, you're not going to get any closer to that idea, you know? It's only causing harm. And the person you were just describing, of course, it resonates with me. It sounds like they have what's referred to as a spiky profile, where people can have this incredible hyper focus that is a surge and maybe results in 40 hours of work being done in like a singular day, or 2 hours, you know, and then there's just off mode.
Yeah.
Reflecting back on my earlier career period, I had a manager that noticed this trait in me actually and asked, how could we probably help sustain you in these surges that you get, this incredible productivity that I don't understand it. It's not how I work. And she was very set on wanting to help me sustain that. And I think I compassionately responded to her saying, like, you don't expect your phone to operate at 100% battery 100% of the time, do you? When you're asking things of it. Like, I can't be at a 110% 100% of the time. There has to be fluctuation. Mine just looks more dramatic than yours. Mine's just more exaggerated, I guess.
Well, I think it's amazing that you said that and were willing to say that and were willing to advocate for yourself. Because I know there were times in my past when I absolutely wasn't. So I think that's also a really powerful example for everyone listening to advocate for yourself. Hopefully the culture is safe for you to do so. And I just think I just want to reflect that back to you. That's
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
hopefully there's, you know, clear, defined performance standards within company policy that allow you to be a better self-advocate, because you can say, this is how I am meant to be measured and assessed. These are the criteria under which you want me to deliver. And I'm doing that. Whether I'm doing that in, you know, 40 uninterrupted hours over a period of 5 to 7 days, or if I'm doing them all across 2 days, having a rest, having an incubation period and coming back to it, shouldn't really make a difference if we truly agree that those baseline productivity metrics are what we care about.
Yes, exactly. Brilliant. It's been so great having you. And just for everyone listening, we are going to link up Mikaila's LinkedIn in the show notes. But before I let you go, And just as a reminder, everyone, by the way, there will also be a link to obviously my LinkedIn, but also if you want to come on the podcast, a little application or send it to someone you know. Is there anything that, like, any last final points or final thoughts that you want to share the listeners with as we speak about the intersection of policy and culture?
I think maybe I would just leave them with a challenge, which is to stop thinking about policies as rules and start thinking about them as opportunities, because that really is simply how I feel towards them. And I didn't always. I also used to have this mindset of policies being really constraining, they're a bad rep. And now I've gone completely opposite direction where I don't feel we need 100 policies, mind you, but I see the opportunity within any given policy that needs to be created. And more often than not, we're not designing for edge cases and trying to punish or penalize like the majority for the one person that might accidentally or intentionally go outside of the lines, right? But what we are trying to make sure of with policies is that the response is consistent and fairly applied to all. And that's where I got that sense of policies are a justice mechanism from. This is a way to make sure that we are applying the same consequence, that we are applying the same standards, regardless of a person's stature, tenure, cultural background, etc. So yeah, those are my parting thoughts.
Powerful parting thoughts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you to everybody for listening. As a reminder, this is a new podcast, which means if you like it, you sharing it will actually help us reach more people. And of course, leave a review if you fancy doing that too. Thank you so much, Mikaila, and thank you, listeners.
Thank you again so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yay.